Yes.
Good evening, everyone. Hi, my name is Naledi Masilo, and I'm president of the New England Conservatory's Black Student Union, and I'm super excited to have you all here. Thank you for coming. Please give yourselves a round of applause for making it past the practice room obligations. Awesome. So tonight is the second night of our Being Black in America series. We've been talking about different aspects within the Black community, like things that affect us, things that we affect onto the world. And tonight our topic is Black masculinity, and we'll be having 5 panelists from Berkeley and NEC kind of engaging on this topic. You guys will also have a chance to engage on this topic, ask questions. And we're so lucky to have Dr. Martin Pierre, who will be moderating the panel. I actually don't have a bio for him, but he will explain himself. But he's an amazing person. I have met him. We have spoken about these topics, and it's really great to have somebody that is knowledgeable about these, that has lived experiences to contribute to the conversation. So we're very excited about that. I'd like to tell you guys a little bit about the Black Students Union. At NEC, our mission statement is that the Black Student Union is committed to the fortification and celebration of Black art, culture, Black art and culture in the NEC community, the advocacy for equal representation and inclusion of all students at NEC, and the belief in educational practices as a means of cultivating fellowship and community. We'd like to represent and ensure equal opportunity for students of color, celebrate and recognize the contributions of the African diaspora and its existence in today's social climate, educate students and the community at large about Black history, culture, and social landscape, interact with surrounding communities beyond NEC through outreach, stimulate discourse amongst youth regarding social issues in low-income communities uniquely from a Black perspective, and develop a critical consciousness amongst members of the BSU and our community at NEC. So our goal is really to bring Black people to the forefront and have our experiences spoken about by us and not for us. So we're really, really excited to have you all here to just engage on these topics. Some of you might be familiar with some of these things. Some of you, it might be the first time that you're in these spaces. This is a safe space for learning and growing, and we're really, really excited again to have you all here. So thank you. I'm going to pass the mic off to Dr. Martin Pierre, who's going to continue with this panel discussion. Thank you.
Good evening. So my name is Dr. Martin Pierre. I'm a Caribbean psychologist born on the beautiful island of Trinidad and Tobago. Yes. So I earned my undergraduate degree in psychology from Boston College. I completed my postdoctoral training at Boston Medical Center, where I worked in forensic, and a consortium at the Boston clinical program in psychology at Boston Medical Center. I worked for different schools, Division of Youth Services, and Roxbury District Court. I'm the co-owner of Ashman Counseling Associates, which is a counseling practice that provides services for marginalized communities. I'm also a staff psychologist at Brandeis University and the newly elected president-elect for the Massachusetts Psychological Association. And so this evening, we are here to interrogate Black masculinity through the voices and lived experience of the panelists next to my left. And the first goal of the seminar is to create a space that allow individuals to affirm each other and acknowledge the systems of oppression and its relative impact on Black males' behavior. The second goal of the seminar is to interrogate Black masculinity based on the lived experience of the panel members here. And the third goal of the seminar is for us to transcend hegemonic construction of Black masculinity, to foster meaningful relationships with our partners, with our families and friends by using personal experiences to construct new narrative of liberation. Now, Black masculinity and race-based trauma are difficult dialogues, and it can trigger feelings of hopelessness, depression, and other trauma-related responses. And it is important that we create a safe space and a supportive environment for each other. If you become triggered, please engage in self-care by excusing yourself. No one is going to say anything, and utilize the resources by the counseling center here. It is important to consider carefully the implication of self-disclosure on your emotional health. You may feel that you may want to share an aspect of yourself, but then, feeling as though you have just allowed yourself to become naked and vulnerable in the presence of this supportive group here, and that could trigger feelings of sometimes shame and guilt. So what I suggest is that if you choose to self-disclose, be intentional about it. And you can even use a third person. You could say, well, I had a cousin, for example, that may have experienced X, Y, and Z. And that way, it sort of allows you to be able to talk about experiences that might be painful. And so it's important that we are here to bear witness and to validate each other experience. In respect to confidentiality, it is important to be respectful and sensitive to information shared in this space. So if you violate one person in this space, then you violate all of us collectively. You might want to talk about your experiences and how it may have impacted you, but you may not use any identifying information or names in order to protect the integrity of each one of you in this sacred space. In terms of norms, assume goodwill. We all have good intention. Be mindful that our intentions have significant impact. Really strive for authenticity and listen to understand as opposed to listening to response. And it's okay to leave room, to be triggered, but it's important to take care of yourself. Emotions is okay. It's okay to get in contact or in touch with your emotions. And conflict is welcome. However, be respectful of each other's opinion. And it's okay to feel comfortable with discomfort. So all people have a social location or self in locationship. Each of our self is defined by our gender, by our race, by our ethnicity, by our social class, by our age, by our abilities, by our religion, by our sexual orientation, and geographic location. And membership in various groups confers a certain set of social roles and rules, power, and privilege. And these social of location and places inform how we see the world and how we construct our sense of self and how we might view Black masculinity. So at this point, I would like the panelists to respond to the question, who are you and where you come from? Talk to us, but put it within the context of your social location. So I would ask Misan to begin.
Hey everybody, how y'all doing? Okay, cool. So, in relation to my social location, firstly, my name is Mizan Asha Willis. I am from Los Angeles, and I'm 20 years old. First 20, at that. I am a queer, debating, non-binary Black woman, and let me check the paper real quick. I am a African American woman. I said Black, and I'm very spiritual. So yeah, I guess that's it.
As the Spirit leads you, you may sort of introduce yourself in regards to your social location. Oh, sorry.
I'm Dave. I am a male identifying, Black identifying, 21-year-old. Go to the school in Oboist to my senior year. From Fort Myers, Florida, born and raised to Guyanese and Jamaican parents. Born and raised Southwest Florida. If you don't know anything about Southwest Florida, it very much is the South. So that's sort of my social location, I guess, in that sense. spiritual, I guess, is how I identify at this point in time.
Thank you for sharing.
Hi, everybody. My name is Mira Williams, and I'm a 21-year-old Black violist who, I'm saying who I am, finishing up my last semester. I'm not doing anything here, but I'm still enrolled. It's completely irrelevant. In regard to my social location, I guess the word queer makes sense for me, but I do hate that word. And in regard to spirituality, I don't think I'm very spiritual, but maybe I'm trying to be.
Thank you.
Hello guys, my name is Todd Bonilla. I just turned 21 last week. I was born in Queens, New York. Then I moved to Kissimmee, Florida in the 5th grade. I'm a jazz trombonist here, although I prefer to be known as just a trombonist because I like to do many different things, be, in all kinds of genres. And anyways, and I am Dominican and Italian. My mother is half of each, and my father is full Italian. I mean, my father's full Dominican, sorry. And yeah, that's who I am.
Hey, my name's Marquis. I'm originally from Houston, Texas. I lived there, grew up my entire life. Then I moved here to Boston. I'm a senior at NEC. I play classical trombone. I identify as Black. And yeah, that's basically it.
Okay, thank you for sharing those aspects of your identity. The question I have next is, what are your initial thoughts of Black masculinity?
I wrote a few notes down, but like my initial thoughts when I think about like Black masculinity, not only for myself, but like how it's been represented in my life, the first thing I think of is like the very sort of hyper-masculine understanding of like what it means to be like a Black person, so someone who is quite stoic, someone who can be aggressive or violent, or might think that solving problems is, like problems could be solved with violence or aggression, or should be solved with violence and aggression. Someone who is on guard, someone who can't cry, someone who is emotionally sort of constipated. I guess those are my initial thoughts, right? One of the things I think of is, causality, right? Like where it might stem from. The thing I think personally for myself and, for what I've seen representing people around me is, I think one of the biggest things that contributes to it is an impoverished mindset, right? Something that you always feel like you're in a space of like scarcity, like something is missing, you need something. And I think we attribute that to our personalities and our egos too, right? It's a thing where we're trying to grasp something all the time, trying to dominate something, or trying to bring it into ourselves and like have it be part of us, so we actually own that thing. That's why in part why we see people dominating different people as if they're like capital, like dominate different things, or walking into spaces trying to claim that space, if it's theirs, or always walking out like puffed up and things like that. Those are my initial thoughts.
And just to push that a bit further, how did you develop this sense of Black masculinity? Where did your ideas of Black masculinity come from, based on what you just said?
So my ideas of Black masculinity came initially probably from my mom. My mom is very sort of calloused, stoic, not very sentimental. I've seen her cry maybe twice. She's always just sort of on guard, tough, unbreakable rock, So I grew up with 5, so it was just her. It was just her and my 2 siblings. We was born and raised in the lower class. I think I said that, lower class. And she's an immigrant. She came here when she was 18, and so we definitely grew up. And she also grew up in scarcity, but she also grew up being dependent on. And we're also West Indian, and so a lot of us can be very quite like rigid and like emotionless and like very quiet too, you know. Additionally, like I remember the last couple of years, just like watching different Black people online, like Malcolm X or like James Baldwin, trying to figure out how exactly I can operate as me, you know, because like obviously like the characteristics of a lot of the characteristics that go into being like really like masculine, I can't actually have, right? Like for example, like being tall or like being like very physically large. I could go to the gym and shit, but like I got to a certain point in time where I was like, there are some things that I can never attribute to me because it doesn't feel right, or I'm not physically endowed, right? I picked up, and that's the last thing I'll say, I picked up a lot of like what it means to be like masculine from either like the people I named or like the cool kids at school, you know, cool kids who like always posted up on the wall, like, why you looking at me, like, you know what I'm saying, like, or like the cats who were hanging around the neighborhood who like kind of like weren't really doing like too many good things, I guess. But they were the cool ones, and they were the ones who I thought had, you know, and so I copied what they did.
Sure.
Yeah.
How about you,
Excuse me. So I guess similar to Dave and probably a few of us in this room, I grew up without a father, and I guess that makes my conception of Black masculinity less of like a characterization or a trope of a type of person, and more of a contrast of ideals. So I grew up in a family of like entirely women, and so all of my interactions with masculinity were in opposition to the women that were in my family and were having experiences with mostly Black men. And I guess also we should probably clarify that if we're talking about masculinity, we're not necessarily only talking about Black men. Excuse me, I'm kind of sick. So yeah, I think that's where my conception of it comes from in terms of like my identity and my relationship to like personal Black masculinity. I think that I guess talking again about like physicality, like I have been, like, I think as often Black women, especially dark-skinned, I don't know, tall-ish, like whatever you want to say that I look like, or other Black women who are often deemed masculine look like, we are often put in close comparison to Black masculinity as opposed to what is considered more ideal, which is probably like white femininity or something like that. So I think, like, personally, that's where my relationship to Black masculinity is.
Thank you. How about you?
So I would say that my idea of Black masculinity very much so comes from my father, in that it is one of his intersectionalities. It's just not something that necessarily defines him. It's something, his manhood is what defines him. And so I would say in regard to masculinity, he is very much so a provider, very much so a protector in ways that irritate the hell out of me, and also in ways that I can, that I've come to appreciate as I have gotten older. And so in relation to myself, I don't look like, you know, a stereotypical woman or a stereotypical person who identifies as a woman. So I would say that my idea of masculinity, or the way I express it, is shown a little bit more in, I guess, traditional ways, in the way that contradicts itself. I think it, as I said, it's definitely an intersectionality and something that complements femininity in a certain sense, and creates a level of balance in certain ways. So that's what that means to me.
Thank you.
To me, when we say Black masculinity, I think, like what you were saying, it doesn't necessarily pertain to only men, but I also think that it shouldn't really pertain to any race or at all. I've personally never really given any importance to sectioning off black masculinity. I've only ever thought of it as masculinity to begin with. And throughout my life, I've never really felt any pressure or influence to act a certain way towards this label we say black masculinity. Because growing up, I've always felt pretty free in terms of this is personally. I've always felt pretty free to express myself how I would like to, and that I don't think that it necessarily needs any label. It's just who I am, that's kind of like how I'm approaching this topic.
Sure. Thank you.
So I would summarize black masculinity in 2 words. I think that black masculinity is exclusive and regressive, and this comes from, my entire life I've dealt with being excluded from black masculinity, and which is really interesting because I say, hey, I'm black, but I think that culture has really informed what being black is and what the black experience is. And I would say a lot of that has to do with, if you look at sports, a lot of the top athletes are of African descent or African American. And I think that in a lot of ways, people idolize sports and they look at that and they say, wow, like a black man is the epitome of masculinity, and this is the peak and the height of what it means to be masculine. And you look at rap culture and how influential rap is, and a lot of rap culture is very misogynistic, and it's about, and this is where the aggressiveness comes in. It's about, hey, I don't respect authority, and it's about rejecting the status quo. A lot of hip hop culture, and personally, I think that those 2 things together is what pieces together black masculinity. And whenever you're someone who doesn't fit into that, I think a lot of times you can be sort of outcasted by the rest of the community. And honestly, it's not a good feeling, because it's like, a lot of times people feel like I can't relate, or, I don't know, I've been called all kind of names, Uncle Tom, you just go down the list, coon, all of that, it's horrible things, but I hear it all the time, and I still hear it all the time. And I think what's funny is that, it doesn't matter how I present myself or how I speak, people still look at me the same way, and we still go through the same stuff.
Thank you. I'm going to interrogate black masculinity and put it into proper context. And of course, my conception could certainly be challenged. So black males in American society have been marginalized and seen as deviants and criminals. And although black male comprise of a relatively small portion of the American population, less than 6%, they occupy a large space in the American psyche and the American imagination. And historically, black men have been target of negative media stereotypes as well as being objectified. Historical stereotypes such as the brute, the tom, the coon, the sambo, violent, dangerous, pronounced level of ignorance, primitive, intellectually inferior, criminal, predator, thugs, deviant, hypersexual, drug dealers, players, and gangsters. In addition, they have been economically oppressed and politically disenfranchised. However, because of the perceived potency of the black male body, sexual prowess, athleticism, black men have posed a consistent and unremitting threat to white masculinity and to the power structure. From the moment black males are born into this world, the weight of social oppression weighs heavily upon their shoulders. The negative impact of this identified variable have been demonstrated across numerous studies, which highlighted the black men as having the lowest life expectancy, highest death rates, highest likelihood to die by homicide, heart disease, and most likely to be born preterm. Furthermore, racism and discrimination have been implicated in the research literature to produce negative outcomes on both the physiological and the psychological health of black males. Racial discrimination has not only been associated with hypertension and cardiovascular disease, but also with increased suicide rates, depression, anxiety, and furthermore, the intrapersonal self. When black males are not able to live up to the white norms or the expectation of masculinity, they have this internal conflict that could lead to psychological compromise, such as anxiety and as well as depression. Traditional masculinity is a set of attitudes, behavior, and roles associated with boys and men. Traits that are viewed as traditional masculinities include strength, courage, stoicism, risk-taking, violence, unrepressed emotionality, restrictiveness, aggression, successful in one's career, high achiever, define themselves through their work, and able to afford possessions requires control as well as dominance. And African American males learn to project a mask of emotionalness, fearlessness, and aloofness to counter the inner pain caused by pride and self-confidence. So when black males are not able to live up to the traditional notion of masculinity, they incorporate a behavioral script called cool pose. The way we walk, the way we talk, a swag. And what it does in defiance, it says that to white America that we are strong and we are powerful and we need to be recognized. The meaning of masculinity changes from time to time. It's very fluid. So when we think of masculinity, we have to put it within the proper historical context. So we have to look at gender, we have to look at race, we have to look at politics and social location. And so we have to consider the transatlantic slave trade and the impact of that intergenerational legacy and how that impacts our sense of masculinity. So black masculinity is developed through the integration of socio-historical, socio-economic, socio-political, and socio-historical contexts. At its most basic level, black masculinity development highlights the intersection between race and gender and class. And so it's a really complex phenomenon. And although a large percentage of black males may represent cool pose in order to deliver a blow that this is who I am and I am in control, and to increase his agency or their agency, there is a downside to cool pose, a sense of stoicism, a sense of not being able to get in contact with one's emotions, and a sense of not being able to identify one internal pain or even to be able to recognize it. The idea of being vulnerable and not being able to express what the person is feeling. And so it's easier to express anger and rage because it's socially sanctioned behavior. But in reality, it is secondary behavior to feeling of hurt, for feeling isolation, for feeling invisible, for feeling depressed, for feeling anger and rejected and not being able to be the provider or to be the protector. So all of these have profound psychological consequences and can not only lead to anger and rage and aggression and substance use and high-risk behaviors, but it could also lead to mental illness. Within that context, how would you characterize white masculinity?
I thought it was a difficult question when they first sent us the questions a couple days ago. And so the way I wanted to answer it was through just kind of recounting my personal experiences grew up, again, like I said, Fort Myers, Florida. To put it in context, I grew up in Lee County, named after Robert E. Lee, like the Confederate general. Lee County is one of the last counties, if not the last county in the United States to be desegregated. And that was in, I think, like 1983 or 4, something like that. And it's quite evident in the population there. I grew up in a lower class neighborhood. It was interesting, right? Like half the neighborhood was like low class, like Haitian, like Mexican people, and the other half of the neighborhood was like lower middle class, like whites who are who have a pool and they're doing okay because they have 2 forms of income in their house. I was on that side. I was on the side with the lower middle class whites who had the Confederate flags flying in their yard, things like that. And so I grew up around poor white people, and when I actually started to get older and got going into some sort of consciousness, started reading Black Thought, things like that, I started to realize and put together white men, from what I've seen, their understanding of themselves and their understanding of their masculinity is very dependent on what Black men are doing in their space, right? I found that because I'm really good at code switching. I could code switch between talking general American English or talking general African American vernacular English, or if I need to speak Patois, I can speak Patois too. And so I've noticed in situations where I've had to speak general American English to speak quite eloquently around lower class whites, I would feel some sort of friction, right? As if I was somehow subconsciously challenging their intellect or challenging their position, challenging who they are, So that's one of the first things that I've noticed. Where they place themselves is very dependent on where we are, So if we're doing well, if we're evidently doing well, or maybe we're not doing well at all, but we look like we're doing well, it challenges them. One of the other things I realized, I feel as though there is less pressure within with white males and with white masculinity to achieve that ideal, because I feel with Black masculinity, and specifically Black males, when we start to grow up and we begin to learn ourselves and know ourselves, there's this understanding, this feeling we got to go out and get it. We got to be this. We got to achieve this. We got to be something, right? Because maybe we feel like we have to be the provider. Maybe we feel like we have to establish some sort of economic foothold or whatever. And so in that sense, for Black males, achieving that ideal is closely linked to our livelihood and closely linked to our success and closely linked to our household. So there's a lot of pressure on that too, to be able to achieve that. And I feel that feeling of impoverished mindset, that feeling of scarcity is not entirely there generally with white masculinity. So I feel there's less pressure to achieve that ideal, There was this last thing I'll say, there was this Bernie Mac bit I saw, because it was maybe 20 years ago. It wasn't PC by any standards. But he was talking about how white men appear quite feminine in comparison to Black men. He was talking about how straight white men would sit like this and be comfortable, or speak with their hands, or do something like that. And would seem comfortable doing that, and it was fine, it was cool with them. But he was also saying that's something that Black men can't do. I remember when I was growing up, I would stand up like this all the time, because I thought if you put your hand on your hip or lean like that wasn't, that's not cool. That's something you can't be doing that. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, I guess there's less pressure. I feel it's evident to me that there's less pressure to achieve the ideal. I think that's one of the biggest things. Yeah.
Can we go out of order?
I'll speak to that. Honestly, if you look kind of throughout history into what you were saying, white masculinity and white manhood was, definitely made to oppress the black man. And you basically, on physicality, Black men were bigger, Black men were stronger, Black men were able to do more laborious tasks. Black men were also bigger in that way. And so they would just oppress them, make them have to face death if they didn't assimilate to the standards that were set for a Black slave. So I think that the execution of white masculinity is in retaliation to how physically superior Black men were at that time. And as he said, I also, think that white men are able to be 10,000 times more relaxed in their approach to life and their approach to achieving their goals. And so to me, white masculinity is very much so able to be more fluid and expressive through life.
Personally, I think that white masculinity is assumed. You know, I think that a lot of times people just, you know, if a white man is doing a job, he's good at it, you know, and he doesn't have to prove that he's good at it. Like, people just look at him and like, he's good at his job, you know? Like, I think there's a lot of assumptions people have for white people, and they just assume that they're good at their jobs, that they're good at what they do. And I think with that, there's, you know, in my experience as a black man, I feel like everything that I do, I have to prove to people, you know, because the expectation is that I can't do things. And the expectation is that I'm uneducated. And there's all these barriers of, you know, people, I've met so many people who just had the lowest expectations for me. They're like, wow, you know, it's so great to see you in college, you know, you're not in jail. I'm like, I'm not supposed to be in jail, like, I'm not a criminal, like, what do you mean, you know? And it's like, is this the bar? Like, the bar is, okay, wow, you're black and you escaped prison, you know? Like, no, like, you know, and I think that a lot of white men don't have to deal with those expectations. And yeah, I mean, it's just really, it's interesting.
To comment on what you said, I feel as if, in my personal experience, dealing with masculinity in general, I feel like a lot of it has to do with the perspective you have of it in your own mind, and how you go into it. This summer especially, I've been working a lot on how I view things, how I view the world around me, my social interactions, just everything in general. And I found that, like, throughout these 2 months that I really went into it, that people would go into things with, like how you're saying, like people have expectations of yourself. And at that point, the ball's in your hand. You can choose whether you want that to affect you or not. And obviously I'm still in the process of going through this, but I feel like the end goal is to just keep doing you, you know? Like, you go into for example, you go into that job interview, you go into that audition or whatever, you just do what you've been practicing, you've been doing, just do what you, like, you know, if showing your resume, you just show your resume. They can have whatever appalling opinions they have of you, but it's up to you to let that affect you or not. And I feel like the moment we start to not sidetrack, but I'll give an example. There was a TED Talk that was talking about bullies, right? And the host, the speaker, asked the audience members to come up, and the audience member was a bully, right? So he just said, just go for me, just as much as you can. So of course the audience was like, you're so tall, your hair is like this, your clothes are like this. And the first example was, he was like, oh, no, they're not. Like, my clothes are cool. Like, I just bought this yesterday. Like, all my friends think they're cool and everything. And then that just gave more and more and more fuel for the bully just to keep hammering. He's like, no, those clothes aren't good. Are you kidding me? I got those like 5 years ago. Like, you know, like, it just keeps going. And the second example, he said, go for me again. Your clothes are like this. Your hair's like this. Oh, that's cool. You look like really funny. Yeah, I can see that. It's like, oh, eventually the bully felt so out of place and so uncomfortable, realizing that they had no effect on this person, that they just couldn't talk anymore, you know? And how this applies to what we're talking about here. I try and go and live my life and go to different places and have social interactions, like I was saying, just representing myself like as I am, you know, everything that I represent, everything that I work for, everything that I strive for, and I feel like going through these things as a mentality, not as a victim, really can help persuade how others view yourself, because I feel like others view you like you view yourself in the long term. Obviously, there's many exceptions, but to just provide one more example, me personally. So our family, my family owns a barbershop in Florida, and we're all Latin, Dominican, so it's a Latin barbershop. So we opened this barbershop in a place that was blatantly racist, and it was going in there, my mother decided to not let that affect her and just go in and make the business. It was one example just to show the environment. A customer came in and my stepdad is a barber in a barber shop, and the barber was like, hey, can you not speak Spanish here? You can only speak that in your country. If you're gonna go speak Spanish, go back to where you came from. He had an option right there. He chose not to give that any fuel and just let go of that, didn't fight back. And 20 years later, that same person is inviting all their friends to come to the barbershop and persuade them. So little things like this can persuade and move your environment around you. That's what I want to say.
Could I respond to Tyler and also a comment that Dave made?
Sure.
So Dave, you mentioned sort of this competition between white and black masculinity, and it's really interesting because I've personally been affected by this sort of competition. So I grew up in I guess the demographics of my area shifted over time, but initially it was predominantly white, and then it became predominantly Hispanic. But navigating through all of that, I found that my presence in white spaces has always threatened white people in those spaces. And I've felt the same way in black spaces as well, but so effectively, I've seen the competition because anyone who knows me knows that some of the things that Tyler was mentioning actually resonates with me. So, like personally, I'm someone who, I'm trying to explain this in the best way. Basically, I'm a firm believer in personal responsibility, and I control things in my life that I can, and the things that I can't control, I don't focus on. So every day I wake up and I'm just focusing on being a better version of myself. And I think we live in a culture now where it's very promoted for us to sort of section ourselves off into these groups and create this hierarchy and be like, oh, like I have 2 legs, this man has 1 leg, this man has a harder life than me, this man will never be able to do whatever, and I focus on taking the gifts and the skills that God gave me and making the most of that. And part of that, I've had a lot of rejection in white spaces because I am a black person who is not of the philosophy that I am oppressed. Like, I wake up every day and I'm just like, what can I contribute to the world? How can I make the world a better place? How can I improve the black community? And I don't personally feel oppression, and I haven't dealt with racism, and I haven't dealt with a lot of issues that are discussed within the black community about police brutality and these things, which they do exist, but and I think what was interesting is that as long as, in these white spaces, as long as I'm of the opinion that I am oppressed and that, that I'm being held back by white people, it's like everyone applauds and cheers me on. But as soon as I reject that and say that actually this, maybe this applies for some people, but this isn't part of my experience, and I don't hold this to be true in my life, people are very quick to say like, no, you're oppressed, and it's almost a sense of like putting me in my place, and they're like, hey, like don't get out of line, and it's real, and it happens to me every day, all the time, and I just and I think that comes from the competition of the masculinity, because it's like, hey, like you are a black man, you're down here, don't forget, I'm a white man. So I mean that's my whole take on the situation.
So let me respond just briefly to Dave and Marquise. Dave talked about this sort of idea of code switching. to be able to negotiate these two spaces, which must take a great deal of energy to be able to really do this, to have this bicultural identity. And Marquise talked about people sort of paying homage to him as being this exceptional sort of Negro, this black man. And the idea of John Henryism, the fact that you have to work very hard, or the fact that they gave you an undercurrent sort of compliment, which can be either perceived as stereotype threat or microaggression. You are different. And the mere fact that you are mentioning it here, it may have occupied a space in your psyche that you now have to contend with. So in a very unconscious way. So how do you think the impact of this John Henryism and the idea of having to be bicultural, to code switch, impact you as males?
Well, I guess I could respond to that. So, personally, I just present myself as I am. I don't try to. Yeah, I've never really fit into a culture personally, and growing up, I was always rejected by black communities and black spaces as being written off as like, oh, here's someone who's trying to be white, or here's someone who's an Uncle Tom, and doesn't identify with whatever black culture is, which was never the case. I always cared so deeply about black culture and the black community, but for some reason that was always a prevailing thing that I experienced in black spaces, and white spaces always wrote me off as trying to be white. So I was always the person who just never really fit in, and somehow managed to intimidate everyone. So.
My experience is the first thing I think of, and actually, I want to say this before there are initial thoughts. It's very tiring. It initially is like a very, very tiring thing, and it kind of required me to not think of myself as I'm this or this, but I'm actually someone who can do both, And there are a lot of people who have to do both and kind of have to, and are both, right? I'm referring to code switching, I guess. Because I remember specifically, like, the first time I had encountered this, I was standing in line at like getting lunch in 7th grade. In front of me was, it had to be like Devontae, and behind me was Aaron Rainierson. And so like, me and Devontae was cool, like my dog. Me and Aaron were also friends. We also and so I remember like, and I'm a very like social, very very social person, and I like love to talk and love to make jokes, and like I'm very active all the time, especially with like my friends. So I remember specifically like talking to Devontae about like whatever, like being here, like talking about this, talking about whatever, and turning around and being like, man, that episode of whatever was really good. And there was a point in time where I was switching back and forth, and then they both caught on to what I was doing. And Devontae was like, bro, what you doing? Like, why are you talking like that? You're not white. Why are you trying to be a white boy? He tried to put me in that space. Why are you trying to be a white boy? Why are you trying to be uppity, et cetera, et cetera? And Aaron's like, man, you're not like that. You don't speak that way. You're not, basically I'm like, you're not one of those like, lower class black people who speak and act a certain way. And so like, that was the first time I realized like, wow, I really can sort of, in a way, speak two different languages. And appear and wear two very different masks. When I got into spaces like, so, cause it's like, so when I got arts boarding school, junior year of high school, when I got into spaces where I was around white people a lot more and around like black people a lot more, like, that shit was tiring. Cause it felt like I had to be a chameleon in different spaces, and it got even more nuanced when I moved between different, I guess, degrees of masculinity, right? Because at my art school there were a lot of different people, and so like usually like my closer friends were like the mean mug, ice grill, kind of like cold, like stoic, hyper masculine dudes. But I also had friends who would embody something similar to like a feminine disposition, right? And I'd also be able to interact well with like women and like very different people, right? when I started realizing like I had to shift myself, like I felt like a physical burden, like walking into a certain space and be like, yo, like, what's good? And being able to have to talk about something but not be able to let go. And then go into a space where I could be anything and use my body and like just be very, very sort of, what's the word? I guess emotive, I guess, or sentimental. That is very tiring. And I feel like it's a burden that is placed on us, but I also think it's a burden that I perpetuate myself, right? One of the things I've been trying to think about is how can I interact with my sort of hypermasculine friends and sort of turn a lock and get them to unlock to get them to come down and get them to not be on guard. That's something I care about because like when you were reading all the things earlier about like, you know, the characteristics of like, the masculine man, I was like, yo, cuz that sounds like, you know, like you read like WebMD and you're like, oh wow, all of this is me, like I must be dying or something. I was like, wow, I must be very like toxic, right? He was like reading all this things, I'm like, that's me, therapy, yep. You know what I'm saying? Yeah.
So one of the panelists stated that in order to understand masculinity, it's important to understand masculinity in relationship to femininity or in relationship to women. If you talk about black masculinity in the context, it's important to put it within the context of femininity and as well as how does that impact relationships with women. And so my question is, how do you reconcile with not living up to the ideals of how masculinity is perceived? You know, I talked about historically in the media, even in rap music, this sort of aggressive and restrictive, you know, that tough cry, emotionless, fearless, aloofness, being able to provide, being able to get in touch with your internal feelings, you know, having a good job. What happens when you are not able to live up to those expectations, and how do you reconcile that?
Oh, well, for me, you know, it was, I think a lot of times people would jokingly just refer to me as white, or white people would, you know, they'd be like, I don't know, you're one of the good ones, or something crazy, you know. And I was like, you know, no, I mean, I'm just me, you know. And I really hated the notion of I needed to fit into one culture, or, you know. And it's like, and it made me wonder, like, well, what is black culture, you know? Like, what is, they're like, oh, you speak white, or you speak, you know. I would hear these things, and I'm like, this is internalized racism. Like, you have a perception of how black men are supposed to behave, how we're supposed to dress, and how we're supposed to interact with the world. You think that I have to be aggressive. You think that I have to wear my pants below my waist. You think that I have to speak in, I don't know, in a different, what is it, AAV? Is there, yeah. Like, you think that I have to speak that way in order to be black. And personally, I just always challenged that and was like, no, I didn't grow up, I didn't learn to speak in that way, so why would I go and do that, you know? Yeah.
Anyone else? How do you reconcile that? Can it be reconciled?
I keep answering so.
Oh my God. So, honestly, I think, kind of to respond to your response, when I listen to it, it seems like it's kind of like summing up black culture, and only kind of like focusing on, oh, I gotta sack my pants, I gotta talk a certain way, and this and that. And excuse me for laughing, but I don't view black culture like that, because black people are so much in such, you know, it's such a big community. And so I kind of like understand what you're saying as far as like, these are what, you know, these characteristics that you mentioned are what white people kind of expect you to be, but also like I'm not about to say what you need to do or don't do, but I think there just kind of needs to be a different mindset as far as like black people just are, just like white people just are, just like any community, you know, just is. And so there's absolutely a lot of work that we need to do as a people to kind of get that together and get everybody on the same page.
Let Dave respond.
Okay. Well, initially, it was a thing where I wanted for a long time to be able to be seen as like hard and like calloused and like tough and really embody what it means to like be an immovable force. These days, it's a thing where like the traits that I've tried to like I guess employ, like go along with like black masculinity, I use that to my advantage and I use that positively, right? So it's a thing where like, you know, can I say nigga here? Is that cool? I wanted to, it's cool if I say nigga, right? All right, I was like, cause like, what it means to be masculine, like niggas don't play oboe, niggas don't like act, niggas don't sing, niggas don't go dance, gender. Oh, like classical stuff, like classical stuff. Niggas be singing, you know what I'm saying? So there's so many things that I've been doing for like over 10 years that it's not attributed to what being like, you know, black and masculine is, but at the same time, one of the things that is attributed to being black and masculine is walking into a space and saying, nah, this is me. You go lay down whatever is what, and you can push it down and keep it there, you know? That was one of the ways I continue to reconcile, you know? It's like, if I'm talking to one of my dudes, and I'm like, yo, I'm thinking about doing this, and they're like, yo, that's mad soft, like, what you doing? Like, I'm like, fam, you could do something right now, you know what I'm saying? Not that I'm gonna like be violent, but I'm like, it's my way or no way, right? I'm gonna do it this way. I'm gonna break the status quo. I'm gonna do it the way I wanna do it. Because one of the things, because I, like, you know, my friends who know me understand that I can be quite sentimental and like very like emotional and like very like soft or whatever, you know. But it's a thing where like, I also can be very, very hard and like very, very callous and also very, very stubborn too. And so I try to use that to my benefit when I'm not fitting in, where I'm like, well, there's no space here, but I don't mean I can't make space. You know what I'm saying? That doesn't mean I can't just plop down and just assert this, you know?
Just to respond, I would say that I'm not categorizing black culture as anything. I think we export it as through our media, through our culture, BET. You know, like what we export is, there's this notion of, you know, you gotta be hard, you gotta be tough, you gotta no one's messing with me, you gotta reject authority. Police, nah, I don't care about police. You know, all these things, and it's like, and you look at a culture that's being held back, and a lot of times we say, you know, we're being held back systemically, but I think black masculinity, this masculinity that we export, is what is holding us back, personally.
If I may, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like either we're not aware of or we're tiptoeing around the discussion of like homophobia and transphobia in the black community and the paralyzing fear that black men have of being perceived as something other than cisgender and straight, which is, I don't know, I guess it kind of sucks to hear you all say it so clearly, and to kind of be fighting both against being perceived as homophobic and also being perceived as, so I guess maybe to kind of have a framework for the fears that we're feeling would be important and helpful.
I mean, even in the context of my practice, I see adolescent and adult males, and usually I do a trauma inventory during the first session, and I talk about issues around trauma. And usually they would say, yeah, I belong in gangs and so forth. Then I would interrogate them on sexual abuse and violence. Usually around the third to fourth session, they will come back and say, Dr. Pierre, you know, I was molested and raped by my stepfather, and I feel so ashamed about it. And the reason why I feel so ashamed about it is because of the guilt that I felt, and the fact that had I shared my narrative, that people would assume or think that I'm gay. And the idea that I got sexually aroused when I was being abused was that I couldn't reconcile with the fact if that's something that I enjoyed, the fact that I got an erection during the abuse. And so I need for you to help me to understand, am I gay, am I straight, am I confused? I need you to affirm that I am a male. And so the idea around homophobia in the black male community is real. And I think that we need to interrogate that. Instead of suggesting masculinity, I'm wondering if we could use the term masculinities, because it's on a continuum and it can be very fluid based on race, gender, based on politics. And so the idea of, I don't want to be perceived, as a woman, or I don't want people, and this is the type of things that prevent particularly males in general, and black males of color, into seeking out psychotherapy, because the idea is that I can be vulnerable. The idea that I'm going to tell the most intimate thing to another male, things that I wouldn't even share with God. I'm co-creating reality in this intimate space. And so even growing up, I recall brothers wanted to express a sense of affection, and they would preface it by saying, yo, this isn't a homo, but I love you and the idea of being socialized into these roles. So I think we do need to interrogate the idea of gender role strain and how that impact us as males, and specifically black males. The same question, how does the idea of not being able to live up to this ideal of masculinity, how might that affect you? And how do we reconcile that as men?
In my personal experience, living up to this masculine figure, I personally never gave it any importance. I continued to live my life and share experiences with how I grew up and what my family represents, what I represent, and noticing a pattern, I really think everything starts with the mind, and how you view things really affects how your behaviors are, how your actions are, and in turn, how people view you. And I feel like with this, this figure, we see it on media, social media, all, the news, everything, this character that's slowly being built of this masculine figure. I always saw that as just the way they wanted to represent themselves, not necessarily how I should represent myself. And I think that separation is very important in terms of mental health and you going through the process. Let's say if you're currently struggling with that, well, I'm sure many of us are, including myself in many different ways. We can use that as the first step into trying to fix that thought that we all have about this. So that's what I just want to say.
To address the notion of homophobia in the black community, I would say this is a multifaceted issue. Well, I guess I would preface this saying that, so I am someone who is Christian, and I would say that a lot of black people have historically been Christian and primarily Baptist. I'm not a Baptist, I'm non-denominational. And I know that within the church, there is a lot of debate over, if homosexuality is a sin or not. But I would say that there are sects of like religion of Christianity that would say that it is. And I mean, let's be real, that's a thing. And I would say that that has definitely informed a lot of the Black community. And I think that it gets used in a very weaponizing and, you know, totally against the way the Bible would preach any of this stuff. You know, it's not, they take the views, and it's not being used in a loving way, it's being used in a very divisive way. And I would say in my personal experience, you know, growing up, it was very anti-gay, you know, and I had a long time where just my parents, I didn't fit into their idea of Black masculinity, and they feared, like they feared, they're like, I don't want my son to be gay. And I mean, I wasn't, but they just constantly, and it was hard for me, because, you know, they were like, you know, you're gonna get kicked out of the house, like, I don't know, like, you know, go play some basketball, like, you know, I don't know, all these things, you know. And for me, you know, I just wasn't hyper masculine, and they were expecting hyper masculine, and they thought because I wasn't hyper masculine, I must be gay. And so this is a real experience I had, and I just think that these are things that, I mean, yeah, it's a real issue. So.
Can you read down the question one more time?
So how do we reconcile the idea of not being able to live up to these norms, to this ideal of what a man should be, even based on the traditional notion of masculinity, being stoic, being able to be a provider? How do we disrupt that narrative about what it means to be a man, and not being able to live up to it, basically?
Gotcha. Well, I can't necessarily do that because I don't identify as a man. But I think, you know, it's very important to stress individuality and the ability to express oneself, but also there is the issue of men, and Black men specifically, being able to conceptualize, yes, I can do this, yes, I can express myself, yes, I can emote, I can give somebody a hug, I can give another man a hug, and it's not an issue. I don't even have to say no homo, like as you said. So I think, honestly, therapy comes into play. I'm a music therapy major at Berkeley, so I'm very much so a proponent of going to talk to someone, and you know, figuring out what the hell is going on. Why do I have, you know, these issues in my head, and why do I have these things that I can't, you know, get through? So I think to disrupt that ideology, I think it's very important that people go within and begin to realize that I am able to just express and be myself and be my individual self in, you know, any way.
Like you said, it is quite like an intersectional like conversation. But I think the most important thing is to like keep shit a buck. And that means like it's using the right sort of language when we're talking about stuff. And so we're thinking about deconstructing what it means to be like hyper-masculine and sort of reconciling that and like changing what it means. That involves like calling out hyper-masculine traits and understanding that hypermasculinity undergirds misogyny and undergirds transphobia and homophobia. Because when we're trying to achieve that ideal of what is man and what is Black masculine, we're trying to move far away from what is considered to be queer, what is considered to be feminine, what's considered to be like associated with women. Because, you know, vulnerability is weakness, weakness is women, weakness is that. That's you know what I'm saying? Like, oh, you love me, bro? Like, that's weird. Like, that's queer. Like, you know, don't do anything like that. Therapy definitely was the way, was the way I began to actually start like speaking about what's going on and speaking about different traumas. But it's a thing where, and I've noticed this, like within the Black female community, I feel like within that part of the culture, there is much more ingrained like an understanding of like community healing within that group, right? Like I've noticed like Black women will open up spaces for other Black women to come and talk and heal and theorize and strategize. And I think, and we talk about this in one of our BSU meetings, like I think that is part of the reason why like these days you'll see a lot more Black women at the forefront of like these political movements. Like at least that's what I see. Like I don't see as many like Black men. And I think it begins with that culture. Like it begins like at the minimal level of like opening the space for healing. Therapy is great. Therapy also is like 1 hour, like 1 day a week, maybe like, but it's a thing where we have to bring that space outside of the space and be able to talk about it. It's a thing where like we have to, and I don't necessarily always believe in cancel culture, but it's a thing where we have to denounce like the hypermasculine shit, man. It's like when I'm like yo, like how are you, man? What's going on? You know, and this is like a very small like example, but like I'm like, yo, what's going on with you? And they're like, cool, bro, cool. Like it'd be a situation where you have to denounce that, call it corny, call it whatever, and get people to show them to themselves, understand what they're doing. Because it's a thing where like, and I'm not calling you out, but because I also found that situation where like we'll say we've never thought about what it means to be masculine. We've never really thought about that. That's, I mean, in part because we occupy that position of privilege that we don't really have to think about it. But also it's very like subconscious, like with all of us, you know. There's stuff I don't necessarily think about. Like I don't think about like walking into a room and then being seen as like scrawny or like not strong enough. You know what I'm saying? But that's because I occupy the position of privilege. You know what I'm saying? It's a long way of saying therapy, but bringing those therapeutic exercises outside, but also education and calling shit what it is. Sure. It sounds like a lot of BS to just say that, right? Because like, how would that actually look in real time? How would that actually look like in educational spaces? How would that look like with actually like action? You know. But those are the things that would need to be involved.
Sorry, real quick. I actually just thought about another aspect of this conversation. Another thing for me is dealing with Black masculinity is I think that I felt a lot of pressure as a Black male from Black women to be hypermasculine. Like whenever I'm in like predominantly Black spaces, I feel that a lot of the Black women in those spaces tend to gravitate towards the hypermasculine men. And you know, if you're not hypermasculine, they just see you as weak, or they're like, I mean, I don't know, I can't think of specifics right now, but I have noticed this kind of hierarchy when being in Black spaces and talking to Black women.
Just to piggyback on what Dave had stated, the idea of coming to a therapeutic office, a therapist's office, you know, it's not within the congruency of an African identity. It's not that Black culture is this monolithic culture, but we share these worldview, and it's a sense of collectivism, a sense of oneness with nature, and a sense of spirituality. So I'm wondering, what would happen if Black males or males in general connect with each other outside the therapeutic office in a group context, using Black aesthetics and music and rap and songs and dance, where they could interrogate sociopolitical rap and be able to talk about it and how it applies to themselves, whether it's about feeling paranoid or feeling a sense of isolation, or having some form of suicidal ideations. The music can create a stimulus where the brothers in them could be able to then talk about the lyrics and talk about the song and talk about narratives or spoken words. So to gather together in a group, which is less, which is a less form of stigma than going to the stoicism of a clinical office. And so I think it's going to be important for brothers to come together as a collective in order to really allow themselves to become vulnerable, to affirm each other, and bear witness to each other's pain, I think is one way of dealing with it. Within that context, if black people in America weren't enslaved through colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade, how do you imagine black masculinity or masculinity would look like today?
Yeah, that was probably one of the hardest questions on the list. It's a thing where I think a lot of us, like especially like black people, will think about, man, if this wasn't this, then whatever would be whatever. And I think it's like always great to think about like that sort of utopian understanding of what things would be like if X, right? But it's a thing where like we keep on saying, this is such an intersectional topic that I think, if black people weren't enslaved through the transatlantic slave trade, through colonialism, I feel like the hypermasculine and toxic traits and characteristics that we see employed today will still be employed, and I think that it would still be a strong foothold institution. I just think we wouldn't see it to such an extraneous and dynamic degree, right? If we're thinking about like, the first thing I thought of was like gangs, right? The formation of community, because that's what it is. Like, I don't know if you guys are involved in gang culture here. Anybody? You don't have to actually have fun with you, but you don't have to. But like, if you like understand like the makeup of gangs, like that's a way of forming community in response to a very traumatic and dramatic and just terrible. It's forming community in the face of something very, very terrible, right? As a response to it, protection to it. That's literally what it is, and that's still sort of how it exists today. But thinking about how gang culture like pervades like a lot of what people understand to be black culture, and thinking about how extra that is, and like you name like what Compton and like Oakland, Zone 6, East Atlanta, Chicago, like Fort Lauderdale, places like that, and thinking about how hypermasculinity in one sense has contributed to like gang culture, and how we see like young men coming together in community. I feel like if we weren't enslaved like through colonialism, we wouldn't see things like that exist to such an extraneous degree. Regardless, it would still be there, right? Because it's not just because like masculinity has transformed through time and again. But it also, I don't want to say always. I want to say always. Like the institution is predicated on the understanding of getting away from what's feminine and strengthening that, and keeping them as very, very binary things instead of one part of the whole. It's a difficult question. I think we do the same thing, but just not as extra.
So I think that slavery made black masculinity what it is today. All the time, like I overhear conversations, especially like in the fitness world, of like people just talking about like, oh, like black people just have these really great genetics, and they just naturally like are really cut, and I wish I could have those genetics. And like, I don't know, it's like people just casually talk about the genetics of black men, which is interesting. But I think that, and I look at the whole situation, and I'm like, that's only because the colonizers came and took all the strongest men.
Sorry. If we're talking about fitness, we're talking about genetics, black people, like specifically West African black people, have more type 2 muscle fibers, fast twitch muscle fibers that contribute to like powerlifting and like fast explosive activity. So that was the thing that existed before, like the genetic breeding of like strong black people. So like, if we're talking about fitness, we gotta keep that above there too. You know what I'm saying? Sorry to interrupt you. I didn't mean, that's really rude, but that's a fact. Type 2 fast twitch, explosivity, powerlifting.
All right, we got Mr. Fitness over here. But, I'm just saying that even if you're saying that it existed beforehand, I don't know all the details, I assume that's true. Even if it did exist beforehand, the concentration of people from that region still breeds this strong group of just black men that probably would have been, I mean, if people were just naturally coming over from Africa, it wouldn't have just been that little Ivory Coast curve, and there'd be a lot more diversity, and there wouldn't be this notion of like, oh, black people are so strong.
Anyone else? How would you imagine black masculinity reimagined? I mean, is it possible even to conceptualize that?
No. I guess I don't see the point. Like, if we're here and slavery happened, you know, and like all of the major powers of the world are based on and are still growing from the backs of black people, not just black men. I don't get it, I guess.
To respond to you, I think, I mean, I can understand, like, why, like, what the fuck are we talking about that for if, you know,
Right.
the shit already happened.
Right.
But I think, to that point, it's important to try to conceptualize that, to then disrupt the idea of hypermasculinity, to disrupt the actual, the existence of hypermasculinity, and, you know, begin to change our environment, because it still negatively affects us. The power structures that you mentioned that are still in place still stereotype us, still oppress us, you know, in a certain manner. And yes, people can think that, you know, they are not oppressed, but there are also structures that don't allow black people to have, you know, certain advantages to succeed in certain areas. So I think that it's important to at least try to conceptualize that idea so that we can begin to make that change. And we can see, like, okay, well, if the shit didn't happen, then that's what it would be like. Well, the shit did happen, but let me see what I can change so that I can be, you know, better, or, you know, figure out something else.
Are there any other response before I open it up to the audience?
Briefly, right? Black masculinity reimagined. I'm like in the middle of what we both just said. It's a thing where it's like, why is it necessary? And it's a thing where, like, me thinking about masculinity and femininity, or whatever, the way we conceptualize it, like, most times, like, these days I think about it as parts of a whole, and that will bring the understanding of fluidity in between, and that will bring understanding of, like, maybe we can represent this as like just a concept of like balance in the world, but not really attributed, like, not really attributed to like how people will form themselves, you know. I don't really see a purpose for it in postmodernity. At the same time, though, with anything like social construction, we have to understand like the ramifications of what we do, and understand like the specifics of what we do and how it's represented, to be able to deconstruct it, right? It's like, we want to get rid of this thing, we don't need it, but at the same time, like, if person A is representing all of these things, how do we call it out and say, this is what that is, this is causality, and here's how we get it out of here? One of the things, and this is like sort of tangential, I guess, one of the things that I found with like finding like sort of inner peace, but also like the young, like sort of like black men around me who also like grew up with like trauma, like in low class, things like that. Looking at Eastern philosophy, looking at Taoism, looking at Buddhism, and sort of understanding things not in the binary sense, not this or this, but everything is more so conceptualized as part of the whole. In an ideal world, one of the things I would do is like stress that young black men who grew up, specifically in my situation, but also something like black people trying to understand their pain, understand their like position, understand their role, and reconcile that. Look at like Taoism, look at Eastern philosophy, look at Buddhism, look at sort of ways to reorient that. Because I think when we think about things that, like, we think about Western thought, it's always like, it's that or it's that. If it ain't that, and it ain't that, it ain't nothing. You know what I'm saying? But how do we make space for everything in between? How do we make space for like new possibility of new understanding, new like ideations, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. Thank you.
So at this point, we would like to open up some questions for the audience. I would ask that you state your name, because that's important to invoke your name, and you could direct your questions to the group or a specific panel member. Remember, assume goodwill, which is the norm. Be mindful of intention and impact. Attempt authenticity. And conflict is okay and welcome, but listen to understand as opposed to listening to respond. There is no one truth here. This is all narrative based on personal experience, based on worldview, based on class, based on gender, based on religion, based on sexual orientation. So everyone have their own truth, and so just be mindful of that. So, any questions? Could you just speak loud? Just no.
I'm Bastian from Germany. I don't know what. Oh yeah, Hi, I'm Bastian from Germany in Munich. First of all, thanks for giving all that insight. It was really interesting to hear your view on black masculinity. I just wanted to add to the discussion. It's not a question directly. I just wanted to ask to add to the discussion that growing up in Germany and also in a mainly white space, I'm experiencing, or I've definitely experienced the same kind of issues as somebody of. I am a very emotional being, and I grew up like that, and I kind of got excluded in school because of that. And we have definitely also something that is very much, or that I assume to be very unhealthy in terms of white masculinity. And I think I just wanted to mention that because I think you were saying before, that as a white male you have the possibility to be more aligned with your emotions and more open with it, which I think I agree on, because that's just how it is. How it is, unfortunately. I don't know why, and obviously this isn't a big issue. I just wanted to mention that for me, and I definitely struggle with that too. Having that pressure of having to be something that I'm not necessarily identifying with. Also, somebody mentioned before that there was an expectation of women towards men to be masculine, and especially hyper-masculine. I think it was you, yeah? Yeah. I feel that way too. In my space, and I felt that way in my space. And I just want to encourage anybody that is identifying as masculine to, and not even identifying as something, just be yourself. And that's actually what I want to say.
Thank you. Any response?
I think that really speaks to one of my first comments in terms of speaking about masculinity in general, as a whole, because I feel like if we can all just have a discussion about masculinity in general, we can all help each other understand ourselves better and speak our own experiences and learn from one another. Like you said, when you're commenting, to listen, not to just get ready for the argument. So I think that was really, really beneficial for you to share.
So let me just push back on that for a bit. So the idea where people talk about color blindness, I don't see race. I just see you as as a person. Mm-hmm. How does that fit within that schema? So should people? Do you think people should be colorblind and not sort of call out race when that's part of the many identities that we occupy?
I definitely think it should be acknowledged without that, for sure, because there are many differences. There's definitely many differences, but I feel like we should also be aware of that in terms of not crossing the line in terms of just like sectioning different people off, and saying because you're black or because you're white, your experiences, for example, with masculinity, are not valid. So, and I feel like we all can agree in terms of that all of our experiences are valid in their own way, and that although we acknowledge this, it's also very helpful for all of us to have an open discussion about it.
Just gonna have like a brief response. Thank you for sharing. I think just sort of like taking more like a 30,000-foot view, looking at how we orient ourselves within like trying to find the masculine ideal. I mean, we haven't said the word tonight, but I mean we're operating within like a patriarchal structure here, and if we're talking about trying to achieve the masculine ideal, it's a thing. That's what I said a little earlier. Like there are times where I try to find the masculine ideal, and like I feel like it's something that is put onto me, but also something I perpetuate at the same time, you know. And so like it's a thing that like of course like if we're trying to find that ideal, like we're all going to fall into that, and then we're all going to feel like you know, man, I'm not this, I can't be whatever, and it's like that's the part of like the problem, right? It's kind of like we are enforcing this structure that many times we don't fit perfectly into anyway. And to the comment about like women, and you said like black women like feeling like that pressure from them, I kind of see what you're saying. Like there have been times where like, you know, like when I was little, we go to McDonald's, we get like toys from McDonald's, and I would ask for like because they had like the boy toy, like the girl toy. The boy toy would be like Bionicles, be like cool, like guns and stuff. And the girl toy would be like a princess or something. I would go to McDonald's and I'd ask for the girl toy because I like to braid hair. That was one of the things I liked to do. And I was frequently shunned and like called weird, and like I didn't really give a shit. Like I really didn't care. But it was something that I felt from like my aunties and stuff like that. You know what I'm saying? I feel like some black men feel from like an early age like that pressure from women. But I also think when we get older, we project a lot. And I think like we're trying to live up to an ideal that we think they want for us. But most times it's not necessarily so. Like I'm gonna be vulnerable. Like in my last relationship, like one of the problems was she was like, yo, like you'll never like cry. You'll never emote. You never talk about like your day. Cause she'd be like, yo, like how was your day? I'd be like, it's cool. You know what I'm saying? So then I just go about my day, keep on going, you know. And I felt personally that I could never let her see me emote, because I felt that if I let her see me emote or see me break down or see me cry, that she would think the whole integrity of the relationship is falling apart. She didn't think that at all. Like, not even a slight intimation of that, right? But it was something that I was projecting. I was making it up. So I think we have to be mindful of that too. Understanding that, you know, maybe some women would like someone who is hypermasculine and might feel comfortable there, you know. But you know, there's a large spectrum of what people would like, you know. And also, there are many times we might be projecting and enforcing the things that we actually want to liberate ourselves from.
This gentleman, you your hand. Could you state your name?
Yeah. Hello. So I'm David. I go to Berkeley for music business and marketing. And yeah, I really like what you just said about that. I think to add on to that, it's also just, I'm sorry, I was gonna make more of a comment. Okay. I think it's also more about like the power dynamic as well, which I'm really glad you brought that up, because like I know like we do project onto like women, and like that's definitely a factor. And I think in relation to what you said about how you felt like a type of way when like how black women would feel like when you would do certain things, I think it's also bigger to remember that men have a power dynamic, which is also in turn a privilege that we have. And like I think it's definitely, it can be an issue when black women do have, you know, when that is a thing where it's like, oh, they want you to be hyper-masculine, or like that's not okay. But I think it's also important to remember that men have a power dynamic like within itself, and that it automatically kind of makes it a bigger issue to talk about because it's so, like it can be more prominent, I guess, if that makes sense. And then also in relation, I think it's great to not have a mindset of being oppressed. And like I really like, yeah, I remember you were saying how you don't think that you're oppressed or something like that. And I think it's good to remember that, definitely, and like have that mindset of like, you know, having strength and having power. But you also have to remember that there are certain systems that are actually set in place, regardless of your mindset of not being oppressed, that are actually just in the government, they're in, you know, neighborhoods, things like that. So I know, you know, it's hard to like, you know, trust me, I get it, being intersectional, being queer, being black. Like, I know it's hard to be like, you know, I'm not oppressed or like, you know, but there are certain times where I'm like, this is a thing, like just walking around, glitter on my eyes, being, you know, like it's something where I'm like, yes, this is something that is not common, but it's also something that is here and we need to like change steps. And I feel like in the bully relation that you were saying, it's one thing to just back down from a bully and just like ignore the bully, but it's another thing to really stand up to the bully. And if we're truly not oppressed, then we should have no problem standing up to that bully in public. Instead of backing down and just doing our own thing, we should use that same fighting spirit of not being oppressed to stand up to those same bullies. So.
Thank you.
Oh, could I respond real quick?
Sure.
Okay. Basically, just to respond to that. So, like, where I was coming from with all that is like, for me growing up, like I said, I felt a lot of pressure from black women to be more hyper masculine. Yeah, I mean, I felt like a lot of times, like me, like I don't know, it's always seen as like nice or whatever, but you know, like I found that a lot of women tend to gravitate to the dude who would like act like he was gonna hit her in the face, and like, I mean, I don't know, this is what I grew up, this is what I saw, and I was like, I don't know, I thought it was interesting. And just to address because I heard it twice, like people were talking about like patriarchal or like patriarchy. I feel like in society, women also have a very strong role, and I feel like that a lot of the things that men do, the hypermasculinity, like a lot of our motivations are for women. You know what I mean? Like a lot of things that men want in life are because women are generally attracted to men who have these things. You know, the reason why men, especially if you're talking about black masculinity, why, you know, fame, money, and all these things are like so like just constantly fought over. You know, it's not, sure, maybe there's some flex culture of like you want to flex on this dude, but it's ultimately like dudes are going out and like doing these things and feeling like they got to be hard, and like all this is because they want to impress women ultimately.
Can I say something quick? Sure. It kind of just came to my mind when you were saying black women or women in general are seem to be more attracted to someone who seems like they're about to hit them in their face. I think it's important this is a totally different conversation, but I think it's important to think about the dynamic of domestic abuse and how we tend to humans tend to have habits. And so if you were in a household that you experienced domestic abuse, it's very likely that you might get into a relationship to where, mentioning David's power dynamic, where someone is very much so dominant and someone might abuse you or seem to kind of like have that stature. And so it might not have anything to do with y'all, it might have something to do with their background, the way they were raised, or something like that. And for the people that it just has nothing they might not have been abused, I have no clue. And I don't really know what that is, but I think it's really important to consider that.
I'm sorry. I don't know if I can get into nice guys and like the fathers of like girls who were the product of homes and domestic abuse situations being like the cause for girls, all of these girls who I don't think I've ever met, who are like looking for guys to punch them in the face.
I'm not saying that they're looking for that, but I'm saying that people do have a pattern. And
absolutely.
So if you get into like,
but that's not a pattern. Like if you got it, if your dad was hitting you and then you go.
No, absolutely,
understand.
that's not a pattern. That was unfortunately the father's pattern. But also, like, people do fall into relationships to where they can become abused, and it's a cycle. And that, like, you wonder why people who are in abusive relationships don't get out of it. It's because, like, it's a cycle. They get out of the relationship. They have to first like think about, well, okay, well, how am I going to leave this relationship? And that in and of itself is a step.
I understand what you're saying. I
And
think
so I'm not saying that like they're just like looking for that shit, like, oh, where's the nigga that's gonna like bust my shit or whatever. But I'm saying like sometimes like that can be attractive if that's what you're used to. You know what I'm saying? Like for me, my dad, he's aggressive with his words, and he is not so emotional all the time. And I have been around people who are not as emotional, who tend to be aggressive with their words. And so I'm not saying I'm seeking it, but that's what I've been used to. So if I see something like that, it's not something that is new to me. You know what I'm saying? So that's not something that's gonna be new for them. So that's what I'm saying. Like it's something to consider. It might not have nothing to do with you. It just might have something to do with their environment and the way that they have grown up, the nature of their environment.
I think I was initially uncomfortable because the focus of this particular conversation is about the pressures on Black men to be hypermasculine, and I guess we're identifying one of the root causes as women, maybe specifically Black women, and them holding Black men to an untenable standard where they have to be like aggressive to the point of like hitting women in the face, and then in turn women start looking for that, and like that just feels wrong to me. I know that's what I'm just saying, like, yeah.
We have a question.
Yeah, I don't know if this is a question or kind of a statement, might be both. There were two things that stuck out a lot to me during the panel. The first thing was when Marquis spoke about the collective experience or the lack of collective experience, and kind of like, you know, I'm not oppressed, so I'm not gonna walk around like I'm oppressed. Yes, I am a Black man and we're all Black people, but I can't relate to that. And I think that kind of struck a chord to me because kind of in my context and where I grew up and where I'm from and just how my family was raised, so I'm South African, it's kind of like if anything is wrong with anyone in my family, then something is wrong with everyone in my family. So it's kind of like, okay, I can go and live in the suburbs and be rich and not experience what other Black people are experiencing, but as long as my brother and my uncle and all those people are oppressed, then it is also my business to try and make sure that they don't stay in that space. So for me, I kind of feel like the whole conversation about oppression and the whole conversation about toxic masculinity, although you may not feel like you live it every day, it's kind of something that permeates in the experiences of you and will permeate in the experiences of everyone around you that looks like you or that identifies in the same way as you. And in that whole conversation about a collective experience, I don't remember if it was Dave or Dr. Pierre that spoke about, I think it might have been Dave, about, you know, how it's not in African culture for Black men to show their emotions and show their feelings and blah, blah, blah. West Indian, okay. Well, so it kind of struck a chord with me because there's this ritual that boys who are becoming men do in South Africa called ulwalo. So it's a circumcision ceremony. So when you're about 18, 17, you go to the mountains and you stop becoming a boy, inkwenkwe, which is a boy, and you become a man, indoda. And these men go away for a month on the mountains, and nobody knows what goes, well, I don't know because I'm a woman, but they go there and they do all the things that they do. They learn about what it means to be a man and all the, like, you need to take care of your family, you need to do all that stuff. And then there's like a day in that ceremony. It happens with Xhosa people and Sotho people, of which I am identifying with both ethnicities. And on the one day, like, all that women do is kind of go and take them food. Young girls go and drop food and then they leave, but nobody's allowed to know what happens. And there was a movie released, I think about 2 or 3 years ago, I've forgotten the name, and it was very, very controversial because the person who like co-wrote the movie, the movie was said to tell all the secrets about what happens on the mountain, and that's been like a deep secret in the African community for years. And the movie just speaks about, you know, kind of themes of homosexuality in the mountains. It speaks of themes of, you know, how men actually get as vulnerable as they appear to not be in that space. So for me, it kind of, that whole conversation
makes me think about like, are men not vulnerable because of the presence of women, or are men not vulnerable like I don't know, in the African community, it seems that men are very close to each other. It seems that they do get as vulnerable as we are told that they don't get. And maybe it's because this is in a different context in America where we aren't necessarily as connected to the roots, to African roots, where it seems like, you know, that's not what we do because that's not what we've learned or what the culture we've been grown up in. But I think it's something interesting to think about, and I don't know if you guys have any thoughts about that or any experiences on that as well, because I feel like guys as well, like when they're chilling with each other, they're way more open than if women are present in the environment. So yeah, that was.
I'm going to speak to the idea of same gender, same male groups, groups of males coming together in order to talk about real issue. I mean, keeping it real. And I often wonder if women were part of that, would it change the context and the dynamics of the group? Would there be a sense of competition amongst males if women were part of that? And so the idea of having the rites of passage ceremonies where a boy is ushered into adulthood, I think is important. So in the idea of, again, of men of color, men in general, just coming together and just keeping it real, allowing themselves to become vulnerable. Not just talking about sports and talking about, athletics and working out, but having real talk about what it means to grow up with an absent father, what it means to be sad or even depressed or feeling isolated and lonely. And so coming together and talking about real issues, talking about mental health, talking about physical health, talking about having to code switch, all of these things are important. So I think providing a context for men to be able to do that, I think is important. Any thoughts about it?
I absolutely agree with you. And like, honestly, because of the slave trade, that shit, like experiences like that and our rites and passages, they were taken away from us. So as you said, the ability to be around men, like for boys to be around men, to the ability to be around close circles like that absolutely opens up vulnerability. And that's why, I'm a woman, but I was definitely immersed in situations like that. And so that's why I don't have any problem like being emotional, being vulnerable. So I think, like absolutely, as Dave said, and as you said, it's extremely imperative that we begin to open up those experiences and open up those circles again.
I guess one of the first things I thought of was really putting myself on the spot and asking the question of like, who am I being hard for? Because that's something that, when I do have heart-to-hearts like with other men, or I see like things like that happen, like the first thing we do is like challenge each other to break down our walls. You know what I'm saying? This thing where it's like what you being tough for? Like, keep it real. Like, let's talk about it. You know what I'm saying? Keep it a buck. I've been in spaces where it's been just dudes like opening up, crying. You know what I'm saying? Just like bawling their eyes out, talking about real stuff, real experiences. And I've been in situations where there have been women present too. And in those times, I didn't feel as though them being there inhibited me in really speaking my truth and really pouring out myself. But that's because personally I had like a mission to do that. But also I felt comfortable around those people, There's what's the word? There's like a pervasive lack of trust and just real insecurity, like in the souls of a lot of black people. And I guess I'm speaking to like because I can speak to my own experience, like Black American people, especially people who grew up like in the hood, things like that. So it's the first thing about understanding like feeling like you're falling apart when you're actually like emoting for the first time. Because I remember like being in therapy, like trying to like really open up and like really trying to talk about stuff. And there are things that I like repress, even though I repressed them, because I don't trust myself to emote, like function. I don't trust myself to really speak to someone about what's real and what's true and believe that the next time I see them, I'm not wearing that mask of what I just told them. It's a real issue and it's a problem. So I really don't know the answer. I don't know the answer to like if women being present make it hard.
And just to add to what Dave is saying, a lot of men in particular have been violated. Their trusts have been violated. When I think of mental health, I think of ruptures in relationships in general. And if my father violated my trust, if my uncle violated my trust, and the people that are supposed to be there to protect me and care for me violated my trust, then why am I going to trust another brother? Why am I even going to trust a therapist? When people are supposed to love me and they have hustled me, they have lied to me, then I'm not gonna open myself up to be hurt again. And so I have to, become adaptive. I have to create a wall in order to protect myself from being hurt. Before I get to you, get with the brother over here. You had a question? Or a comment?
It was, to get another statement, an idea that came to my head. Nobody said it until recently, you just said. When I think about masculinity, black masculinity, I think, where do you learn to be? And a lot of people in here even probably grew up in a single parent household without a father. Myself, where do you learn to be? Some people will seek out, like you pointed earlier, what they believe black culture is, what it means to be a black hip-hop, gangs. Luckily, I had a mother who was always there, who said, don't sacrifice. She always rejected a lot of the aspects of black culture that were deemed as unprofessional. I just wanted to put it out there that a lot of people grew up without a father, and learning how to be a man is more difficult. I looked to my mom's dad. He's a successful engineer, and he was very smart, the wisest man I ever knew. But he was also an alcoholic. And his wife died early. She was 36. So he was who I looked to as, this is a man, this is what a man is. But I didn't get that point. How does a man treat a woman? How does a black man treat a woman? Because the only example I had was my grandpa. He didn't have a wife, and my mom. So, I don't know, you look, you have TV, you have media, and that's where you learn.
Can I ask you a question? It's been said that mothers raise boys, but fathers raise men. What's your thinking around that? How would you interrogate that, or deconstruct that, or challenge that notion?
I can see it. I don't understand it. I didn't have a father, because I don't know what a father would teach me how to be a man. I'm kind of disconnected from that idea, so I can imagine that would make sense. If I had a father in my life, I probably would have learned at an earlier age how to talk to women, how to treat women, how to take care of a household.
This brother.
What's up, y'all? My name is Edward. People call me Ed. Yeah. I wrote down like a lot, but I'm gonna keep it brief. So yeah, most of the things that I wrote down were kind of about Black image, but the first thing I wanted to kind of say was I noticed this kind of like trend of Black men kind of like going back to the domestic abuse thing. If we see it, it's kind of like, you know, that whole like shut my head, my mom business thing. So yeah, I don't know, I don't really have a question for it, but I did notice that's like a very prevalent thing, both like, that I've seen from random people, from family, from like, you know, all this stuff. I've also noticed, on the subject of like being, the image of being Black and being a man, like some people have said before, it's very prevalent in hip hop, but I think it's interesting, at least to me, how since hip hop is becoming more and more popular and other groups of people are, you know, coming to the forefront of it or trying to, that kind of power to present ourselves in a way that we want is kind of being taken away from us little by little. And I guess my question to y'all would be, how do y'all think it's possible to maintain our control over our image? And because, you know, our image is both showing ourselves to the world, but also showing ourselves to like those underneath us, like, you know, the generations coming up under us. So like how, you know, he was talking about, you know, he didn't have a father figure, but he looked at hip hop and all this other stuff, like that kind of concept. So yeah.
Could I respond to that? All right. So, you know, one thing I always think about is that I feel that as a Black man, there's certain things that I was born into that I have to be aware of. And for one, you know, having to have an awareness of the crime rate that exists in our community and how that affects me personally. So I think that a lot of other races will look at Black people as violent because of the crime rate that we have. I mean, we're 13% of the population, like committing over 50% of crime. So, and that's an issue that, you know, like people don't talk about it, like no one wants to own it, but it's real, you know, it's a real thing. Like you look at the prisons and they're just filled with Black people, and, you know, and a lot of times like we'll be like, oh man, you know, like, and that's just how it is, man. But you know, like the rate of false conviction is very slim, right? So there is a real issue, and like my whole thing with that is just that like, so we have this real issue, right? But then we have like rap culture that takes that issue and takes like the violence and stuff, like maybe the fears that people have of Black people that were, you know, violent and all this, and it just perpetuates it and it exports it across the world, you know? And it says, hey, look, we are violent, you know? So it's almost like, I feel like it's a mockery of itself in a way.
So to get back to, we're talking about hip hop, right? And we're talking about our image, and we're talking about how we're represented, and how we're seen in the world. I think it's a very interesting question. I love hip hop, and while I will like listen to a lot of types of music, I can also be very aware of like, this is problematic. This is an issue. This is what's going on. This is actually this is how you break down the deconstruction of like how this works and whatever, right? Like look at like reading like Kendrick or J. Cole or whatever, breaking down, wow, he's really breaking down like Black thought and like the Black experience, like Black institutions, things like that. Thinking about like trap getting really popular in the whole world over the last like 3-4 years, maybe 5 years. What was interesting was like and J. Cole talked about this on his last album, KOD, thinking about black people being seen sort of these days in hip hop as a sort of like cartoonish character, or like the coon, or like this exemplified stereotypical figure of what blackness is. At the same time, within hip hop, we see like Young Thug like wearing a dress on his like whatever, or like we're seeing like people giving more visibility to Rhapsody, or like the Kelly 47, or Cardi, or people like that, right? It's interesting. What I think is going on is like, I don't think it's a thing where like we're exporting our pain and we're exporting like this image of like the cool whatever like around the world. I think what's going on is that this is an explication of like real life situations, and it's now being globalized, right? And so what is it like when someone reads who you are to you and you don't believe that's who you are, right? What happens when someone reads like what you're trying to exemplify to you and you don't believe that's who you are, right? Thinking about Young Thug, but also like Lil Pump, or whomever might represent this like SoundCloud whatever category, as part of like the same sort of system. And I think within that, like, you know, because I talked about being cognizant of like the problematic stuff going on in hip hop, but also, gosh, I lost my train of thought because there's so much going on. But thinking about how we turn our heads from that too, you know, it's a matter of like keeping it buck, you know, thinking about, yeah, we're talking about gang shit, we're talking about like murder, we're talking about like moving drugs, but it's like that's like lived experience. That's like a lot of lived experience. What does it mean when you detail that on like a global stage and talk about it? Does it mean you have to internalize it? Does it mean that it's perpetuating what's going on? I don't think so. Because I think if niggas didn't have hip hop, like we would have a lot less money as a black institution. We still be moving drugs. We move a lot more drugs too. You know what I'm saying? And speaking to the crime rate statistics, my nigga, those are off. Those like a little bit off. Right? Thinking about black people contributing predominantly to the amount of crime, I think using that statistic in this sense skews the perception of black people and enables the perception of like us being like violent, and it sort of trivializes the real like indignities going on in our own neighborhoods, right? So if we're thinking about like what's causing the crime, you know, what's causing like the violence, what's causing like moving drugs, right? And what we consider to be like a felony, you know what I'm saying? Because if there are a lot of black people committing felonies, but walking down the street while being black is a felony or something like that, like, yeah, we're gonna occupy this disproportionate rate of like of the crime rate. You know what I'm saying? Yeah.
I think we have time for one, maybe two more questions.
Sorry, I'm sick, but I was wondering if the two of you would talk more about the Black queer experience.
What's your specific question?
I just feel like it wasn't covered very much, and I'd like to hear more from you guys about that in the context of Black masculinity.
For sure. It's heavy, that's deep. But I think it is very much so overlooked. If you're looking at black men, if you're looking at black women who present themselves more masculinely, it is very much so overlooked. And I think it is important that we begin to open more spaces for them to be able to express themselves. And I think, wow, good fucking question. I don't know. What do you got to say? I'm gonna get back to you. Okay.
I don't know if I have a lot to say. The Black queer experience as it relates to masculinity. I mean, it's a life, you know? Like, I don't know how to, I guess, express how a life is lived, but I think it should be thought of as a full and complete life lived. Like, often I think black trans people's lives are thought of in very stringent ways, like, you're dead, you're thrown out of your house and then you're dead, or, you know, someone else, you're dead. Or you're like RuPaul or something, which is great, but I don't know, I think most black lives involve a degree of grappling with masculinity. And so I guess I don't know that Black queer lives are different in that sense, and it would be maybe helpful to think of our lives as more integrated with each other. Like we're all, as you said, on the continuum of masculinities, and yeah.
Hello, everybody. My name is Monty. So my question is kind of burning with me since I've been listening. But thank you for the panel. Great continuing conversation. But for you all, I think I came in a little bit late, but I believe you are from like different parts of the country. I don't think any of you maybe have grown up here in New England or Boston. But in particular, I'm curious, what does Black masculinity or masculinities look like for you here in Boston?
I want to answer. It's been a lot. It's been a lot here. At times it's been pretty uncomfortable. Just being in this space and like not even having to deal with people, just being in the city with this weather. It's been a lot because I'm from LA. But I think about, you know, myself and the way that I kind of like present myself or the way people perceive me a lot more than I do when I'm at home. I was actually like walking across the bridge, across the Charles today, and I had my phone in my hand, and I was like, okay, let me put my phone in my right hand so that this motherfucker that I'm walking behind doesn't think I'm trying to like snatch their shit or whatever. And I'm like, why do I need to think about that? A petite, maybe 100-pound, 5'2", 20-year-old girl, like, what am I gonna do? But I think because of the environment and because of the way that we are treated here specifically, it causes me to have to think about that. In another situation, two of my friends were in the Peru, what day was that? 2 days ago. And we went into a perfume store, and there was a woman of color who was like on our asses. I had a receipt in my hand from CPK because I was buying her some fucking butter cake, and I was like, I have money, what's not clicking? Why do you think that I'm trying to steal this perfume when I literally just came in here to smell the shit? That's it. So yeah, like I said, it's been pretty uncomfortable, but there's some folks who are very nice and lovely. But yeah.
I think, well, my experience in Boston has been really interesting because I meet a lot of people who have never been to conservative areas, and so coming from the area I lived in Houston is called Harris County, and Harris County is traditionally very conservative, and it was interesting because I have a lot of friends who support Trump, and I would say that moving out to Boston for me was when I started experiencing like me feeling like I'm somehow othered or like less than other people, and I would say that a lot of this derives from like intersectionality, so in my experience, like when I came to Boston, a lot of people had assumptions about me and my experiences, and they wouldn't believe me when I would tell them that I'd be like, yeah, I haven't dealt with police brutality. Like, oh, sure you have. We know what, and this would come from primarily white people, but it'd be like, no, like we know, like it's so hard being black. We know, like we get it, And there is this constant notion of like people assuming that they know my experience and they know my masculinity, whereas when I was in, the scary conservative area, like everyone just treated me like they didn't know anything about me. They're just like, hey, it's nice to meet you. What's your name? Like they didn't know anything about me until they asked and found out.
If I may say something, in terms of my personal experience and how moving to Boston has changed the way I've perceived things, I was born in Queens, but I feel like I grew up as a person in Florida. I moved there in 5th grade, and that's when I, the middle school and high school, that's where you find yourself and all this stuff. And throughout that experience, with all my shared moments with people, I've never really had to think about the idea that I might be different. And I understand that that's definitely a privilege in terms of my personal growing up. And when I moved to Boston, I remember this, I was auditioning here. It was the summer before my freshman year, which was like about 3.5 years ago. I was in a car with my family, and we were driving, and I was like, yo, where is everybody of color? I was like, what? It's like, oh, we found one. And I was like, what? Like, I've never experienced anything like that until I came here. And I feel like that was like the beginning, the first step of me like seeing my surroundings differently. And I feel like coming to Boston really kind of showed me a different perspective of things, and in a way I'm very appreciative of that. And just being more knowledgeable about different situations, different geographical locations and how they function. But also it kind of backtracked my process in feeling like I should be different, or feeling that I am different and I should be like pushed aside or something like that. I felt like I didn't belong in some spaces, and that was a big shock for me. I've never really felt that way, like walking into a room and then feeling like, oh, I'm different now. Like I gotta act a certain way, like you were commenting on before, like like different codes or different things. And I never really did that until I came here, and I feel like that really opened my mind to different things coming to Boston.
We got time? Almost. You can say something. We have a question. We have a question, right?
Well, it's more like a comment, just about like that. I lived in the South. I lived in New Orleans for the last 5 years. And like coming here, it's like it's really funny because New Orleans is a majority black place. Like blackness is just like an accepted fact. Like it's just like that's the way the city is. And living in downtown Singapore and do like that. And like moving to Boston, it's funny how like all across the north, there's like this appearance of like liberalism, but it seems like people are like really cool with the black people that aren't actually like there, Like being in Boston, it's like everybody has this like cosmopolitan, like very liberal attitude, but there's like this total lack of diversity. Versus like in the South, there's actually a ton of diversity, and like the problems come from people actually encountering each other.
Yeah, I was going to say something real quick. Because my experience was a little different than y'all, because like I said, I'm from Fort Myers, Florida. Like Jim Crow's still out there, like you see him like on the side of the road. But what's interesting about like Fort Myers is like
You saw Jim Crow?
Jim Crow's still out there. I swear. I was like, I thought it was like a joke. Whatever. Jim Crow's still out there. I'm serious. Like, but if you think, because I've done like some study with like the demographic makeup, and like also like when I figured out, like there's this headline that Fort Myers is one of the fastest growing cities in like the United States. I was like, where do you think Fort Myers? Like really? So I was thinking about like what went into like how that happened. But I'm not gonna go into the whole conversation. The makeup of Fort Myers is like this weird blend of northern racism and southern racism, in the sense that like if you see someone, because like if we think about southern racism, that's like the more overt racism, and northern racism is that more covert racism, right? So it's like no one's gonna call you like a nigga, like more so up here as opposed to down south. Like you walk into school and you gonna get it right away. You know what I'm saying? And it's like what it is. I'm serious. I'm like on everything. I'm serious. So when I got here, like I was already kind of like primed to like be in a space where like the niggas are over there and that's what it is and everyone's cool with that. And it's an unspoken truth and everyone's cool, and that's how like everyone moves to the South. So like my experience was like trying to like find a map and see where all the black people were at. So like what I did is I had to cross register at Emerson, and that's where I found like my roommates and like all the black people. I was like, oh, got like 3, 4 y'all here, because also PWI, there's like maybe 3, 4, 5, 11 black people there. But my experience here was like trying to find black people, trying to find comfort in that, right? Because like I could walk around Fort Myers, like I walk around downtown, walk around in like East Lee County, walk around whatever, those are the hood, and I feel fine. But like when I moved here, that was like the first time I was like walking around like in the hood, and I was like, dang, I might not be like, accepted here. You know what I'm saying? Which is like a very like specific thing. I don't know if you like experienced that before, but like to walk around in another like black person's hood, like other black people's hood, but you're not really from there, but also you're not from the city at all. Like this is a immense feeling of isolation. And so like my experience was trying to find, like I found most of them that are at the school.
I think we should wrap things up, but I think there should be a call to action. I want to challenge you. This should be the beginning of many conversations. This is only the beginning of many conversations to have. And I would encourage each one of you to create silos and to have these difficult conversations. You know, black males across the global diaspora are one of the most powerful and creative creatures that we have known to humanity. And we need to bring together scholars and dancers and teachers and poets and hip-hop artists and musicians and policymakers, spoken words performers, in order to celebrate masculinity and affirm it as well. And so we must continue to create, to actualize, and live out counter-narratives that mediate hegemonic construction of black masculinity, and particularly the negative stereotypes that are portrayed in the media as males being beasts and hypersexual and sexualized and aggressive. And we need to seek to produce and construct knowledge that represents multilingual, multi-ethnic, and non-conforming gender identities that are not rooted in this sort of Eurocentric construction of masculinity. We have to redefine ourselves. And it's important that we continue to interrogate ourselves and challenge these notions of masculinity. And so the mere fact that each one of you are here today, it bears testament and witness that we have begun to do the work. And so my challenge is for each one of you to continue to affirm and acknowledge each other, to bear witness to each other's pain. For brothers and sisters to become vulnerable, to be able to emote and get in touch with their internal pain. So I have 3 requests for you. The first request is that I would like for you to give yourself a round of applause for being here today. The second request is that I would like for you to give a round of applause to the panelists, the stellar panelists. And the third request, in no order, but as the Spirit leads you, to call out a word that would describe your experience here tonight. And for me, it is gratitude. I'm gratified by this conversation. So as the Spirit leads you, just yell out a word that really describes your experience here tonight.
Open.
Revealing.
Reflective.
Insightful.
Thought-provoking.
Connection.
Genuine.
Authentic.
Enlightened. Pensive.
Stimulating.
Intense.
Beautiful.
Empowered.
Important. Important.
It's always tough leaving a sacred space where emotions are high and feelings are sometimes triggered. And you know, I was telling Evan, you know, but we need a song. We need something to remind us, you know, that we have purpose. So do we have any singers? Do we have, you know, I wish I had sage to burn or libation. But do we have a song in order to invoke the experience of finality, of closure?
Down. Evan.
Do it.
Let's see it.
So I want to say thank you for being here tonight. I want to say thank you to Dr. Martin Pierre. And before I sing this song, so I want to give Dr. Pierre this gift from the BSU. Thank you so much for your time. So grateful for all of you here tonight, and you. And this song is from me to you. Please feel free to sing along if you know it. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. 'Twas blind, but now I see. You know that song, right? Thank you so much. And just so you know, this is one seminar of an 8-week educational series hosted by the BSU. Next week we'll be here from 7 to 9 p.m. with Delka Prescott talking about Black or Woman. I hope to see you there. It's going to be amazing. And for the weeks to come, thank you for being here tonight. Thank you so much. A round of applause for the panelists. Dr. Martin Pierre. Have an amazing night.